A long time ago, before you were born, the old people told a story about a visit from the wisdom keepers. The wisdom keepers told us the light-skins are coming, and their numbers would be great. They will bring great destruction and confusion, that we will go through a time of testing. They will bring 4 mind changers to make us forget our ways. The mind changers would be a liquid, a black book, a song, and a card. They will take your land. They will poison the earth. They will bring disease and sickness. They will kill the women and the children. They will destroy our culture. Only our spirituality will be left. After the testing time, a great healing will take place. The eagles will come back. The buffalo will come back. We will come back. The prophecies will come true. We are now in the time of the fulfillment of prophecy. The story that happened has never been told. Now is the time to tell the story.
Genocide tactics, as defined by the United Nations. Number 1. Killing members of the group. An example of that would be the Wounded Knee Massacre. Number 2. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. A good example of that would be the 1862 mass hanging. Number 3. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part. A good example of that would be the longest walk made by the Navajo Nation or the Cherokee Trail of Tears. Number 3. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. The United States government sponsored sterilization of Native American women. Number 4. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. In 1879, in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the first of 500 boarding schools. It happened here in the United States of America. Some of the genocide tactics included massacres, forced relocations, sterilizations of women, boarding schools. California alone paid $12 million on Indian bounties. After the atrocities, only about 1% of the native population remained, making this perhaps the largest genocide of the 20th century. Genocide was sanctioned under 24 U.S. presidents from 1830 to 1933. Manifest Destiny, a term that was coined in 1839 and revised in 1845 to sanction the colonization of North America. It was used to designate the belief that the United States was destined, even divinely ordained, to expand across the North American continent. Thousands were murdered and relocated in the name of Manifest Destiny. By 1920, 99% of all Native Americans were wiped out. In 1879, the U.S. government implemented the genocide tactic of removing the children from their native culture and placing them in one of the 500 new boarding schools. This was an attempt to eradicate the Native American culture and assimilate those children into European culture. In 2008, a gathering took place in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The purpose of this gathering was to talk about intergenerational trauma. The pain and hurt at this conference was so intense that the elders instructed us to make a 7,000-mile journey across the United States. We traveled to current and former boarding schools to gather these stories from the people who attended when they were children. We recorded the stories of what happened to them. Here are their stories.
The stories that we heard on this journey from these elders were so unbelievable. Some of the elders, they even had a very difficult time even talking about what went on there. Many of the elders who told us stories of what happened to them was the first time that they ever told a story to anybody, even their children, their spouses. No one had known the experiences that they had in these boarding schools as children.
Said he liked this boarding school. Well, I, for one, hated the damn place. And I can start out with, I don't know if anybody here remembers their life when they were 6 years old. I do. It was right here at this boarding school that, I'm going to mention that name, Mr. Care. Boy, did I hate that son of a bitch. I mean, really, really hate. And I didn't know I was supposed to ask this man for permission. I'd come back that evening and, then he knocked the hell right out of me. There's a window there. He'd shut it, make sure nobody saw it. And when I got back, damn, he just whipped me all over my damn body. I mean, he knocked the hell right out of me. And neither one of us knew how to cry because we weren't supposed to cry.
It is said, "The truth shall set you free." The stories we heard on the journey of the beatings of the children for speaking their language, the violence to the children, the punishment system, the sexual abuse is directly tied to our current day community issues of alcoholism, drug abuse, violence, and sexual abuse. This is called intergenerational trauma.
Because this happened over 100 years ago, 130 years ago, and that historical trauma passes on from generation to generation. And we see many angry young people and others who don't even know why they're angry. And if we look back, we're treating the symptoms, but if we look back, we'll find the root causes go back to this time. When genocide took place.
I remember me and my friend, another girl, well, she was my relative from Cheyenne River. We were in the dormitory and we went out the back door, and it was the roof, and we didn't realize it was the roof, but we went back in, and that night we had, they called our names. They called a whole bunch of little girls' names, and so we all got in line, and the sister opened this door, and she took one little girl in there, and pretty soon that little girl was just crying, and she came out, and then the next one, and we realized they were getting whipped in there, and when it was my turn to go up there, and I went in there, and that sister told me that I was on the roof, and I was somewhere I weren't supposed to be, and so they pulled our pants down, and that was our first whipping. The first day I got there, the first night, that was my experience with the first day at boarding school.
I'm the last of the family of 9 children. My oldest brother went to boarding school, never came back. Only his body was brought back. And I had 2 other sisters, later years, lost their lives to alcoholism. I come from a family of alcoholism.
And yes, there was sexual abuse in our time. Yes, there was. But we weren't allowed to talk about it. We were given cod liver oil by the tablespoonful for talking Indian. We were slapped with yardsticks for talking Indian, for whispering, or wanting to go to church. We couldn't have a best friend. They'd break us apart. Like someone said, they got separated because they were too close. And that's the way it was. And that's the way it was in boarding school.
As soon as we got to the school, they cut our braids off. They didn't even have the courtesy to unbraid it, they just chopped them off.
But with the Lakotas, if you cut their hair, it means mourning for them. And for these children, they had to have their hair cut. And it is said that they cried throughout the night over this. That was very smart on the teachers and Pratt in the beginning of the brainwashing that they did to these children. Their whole thing was to totally take away their identity. They changed their names from their native names, which for all of us, it symbolizes our heritage, our pride, our accomplishments. It says who we are and where we stand. And they decided to take all the Indian names away and give them common American names to take their self-worth and their self-identity away from them. That was just part of the brainwashing that they did to the children here, besides cutting their hair. When the children were caught speaking their language, they were brutally beaten. There's a house over here that they call the Ashburn House. And there's the Ashburn House and the Pratt House. One of those houses used to be the discipline house, and the other one was their mess hall. The stuff that they did to these children was unbelievable. They sexually abused them, they mentally abused them, and they physically abused them. And even better, they would get the native kids to determine what punishment they would get. And if the children did not give a good enough punishment, then the ones that were asked to give the punishment also got punished. And the punishments were quite immense. And to have a house specifically just for that, you could just imagine what happened in there.
My grandfather's in 1898. I have pictures of him at the Fort Taunton boarding school in North Dakota. I called up Fort Taunton, it's now a historical site, and I asked them if they would take me through the school, through the site, because the elders that I was interviewing there were talking about a dungeon, a basement that they were thrown into. And one of my friends, Judy Kakinawash, Flying Eagle from up home, said her father was thrown down there for speaking English, and her father would just sing Indian Ojibwe Sundance songs at the top of his lungs when he was put in there. So they knew that it was under the boys' dorm, and sure enough, there was a door that was locked that the park people took me down, and we had a flashlight. It's a huge basement down there, huge, thick boulders that are underneath Fort Taunton. The fort can fall down, the bricks are crumbling, but that basement will be there forever. And it was just by luck that we found this dungeon. It was this room that was described to me by the elders, because when they made it a newer school, not the boarding school, but a newer school in like the 70s and 80s, they had to put water pipes in, and so they had to bust out some of the huge walls down there to put the water pipes in through the ground. And we saw one that had a hole in it, and we couldn't see what was behind it, so we got a ladder and we put a flashlight in there and looked in there. And we could see that there was sort of a half ladder coming down from the top of the floor. So it's to take me to where that's above there. And it was what would have been the headmaster's bathroom. And there was a trap door, and that's where the kids were thrown down. Because there was no light there. The other rooms that were down there had little tiny windows to the outside, but they had bars over them, but there was light. I said, no, they all described a very dark room where there was no light at all. So my auntie that was there, she wouldn't come with me into the school. The elders, many elders want it razed. They want it destroyed because of the horror stories there.
Then when they'd bring the Paiutes up for their haircuts, we'd all be deloused again. They had to bounce a quarter or a dime on our bed. We had to learn how to make our bed. We had to wear shoes and socks. They took our moccasins away. Levi moccasins, our canvas moccasins we had, because we didn't wear shoes at Sililo.
Now that we're going back to our ways, and it's real, because there's this thing called Lakota Dakota Language Summit thing, and in our tribe it's ran. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm not saying any of this is bad, but before you go forth and do stuff, you need to acknowledge those people that suffered away from those agencies that kept that stuff alive, way underground. Before you can go forth and, act like you know everything about the culture, you need to go back and honor those people and say sorry, because they really did. They really did suffer and starve to keep those ways alive.
Who did what they did because they were brainwashed. That I forgive you. But to the United States government, I'm not there yet. But I'll say this to you, the way I started, is I'm not brainwashed and I'm not defeated. I hope.
And my sister went too, but one of the things that my sister just talked about in the last couple of weeks is that every night before she went to bed, she would always hear screams from the boys' side of the boarding school.
But Indian kids, one of the reasons we even now have such a high suicide rate among Indian youngsters is they get caught between cultures. In the olden times, almost every tribe, as an example, had a process that you went through as a teenager. Sometimes it's called a rite of passage. Sometimes some tribes might call it puberty rites. It's when a boy becomes a man or a girl becomes a woman. And in the old cultures, there was a very clear, defined way that you do it, and an actual ceremony that you went through, after which you were then pronounced a man or a woman and you were no longer a child. That's gone, but there's never been anything to replace it. And I think in many cases it's left Indian kids in sort of a limbo, not quite sure what they are or where they are. And because of that insecure kind of a feeling, I think that reflects itself in a high alcoholism rate, high drug abuse rate, high suicide rate, high dropout rate, high everything rate that is bad, unfortunately.
We want to begin with a simple proposition. The proposition that the character of Indian people has been deformed by the sustained assault on native cultures. To take our lands, non-Indian people had to convince us we were something other than what we were. To kill our ancestors and take our lands, they had to define us as something less than human. To colonize or exterminate a people, you must first define them as a weed. You must transform them from a person to a pestilence. Once objectified, they can be killed without thought or remorse, but this process is even more insidious. The ultimate evil inflicted on Indian people was teaching us to hate ourselves so deeply as a people that we began killing ourselves and killing each other. This was the legacy of the boarding schools.
Thinking about all of the children, thousands and thousands of children, maybe over 100 years, that were taken from people they knew and loved, torn away, and taken to a place they didn't know or understand, not knowing what was in store for them. and not having any control over that, ever. Going to a place where they were stripped of their identities. Having to become in the graven image of the conqueror. Like they said here, stripped naked, deloused, their hair shorn, and made to put on government-issued clothes that were foreign to them. Shoes that restricted their feet, that they never knew how to wear, not much less walk. Tortured and tormented for speaking the only language that they knew. Many of these thousands and thousands of children left, were torn away, their people crying of heartbreak. And they never came home. Little ones, not buried in their buckskin or their traditional garb, not given a feather to take them on their journey, not having the benefit of the drum to take them to the other side, not hearing the bell. They died. And maybe they were put in a box, or maybe they weren't. They were just thrown in there in their government-issued clothes. And that was the end of them.
Another lesson we learn on our journey, that some of the Indian children who were sexually abused in the school when they were young became sexual abusers themselves when they became the older students. This Navajo elder describes the emotional scars of being victimized by older students.
But the fall of 1962, I came here excited, and I was also scared. I didn't come here by choice. I was told to come here. And when I first came here, the first few months, my clothes was all stolen from me. And I tried to find my clothes, and I seen other girls wearing my clothes, but they wouldn't give it back to me. So they called me a troublemaker and a liar, and I got beat up for it. But as time went on, you know, they made my life hard. I don't know if they're the ones that set me up, but one night I was walking back from the library, and some boys grabbed me. They put their head over my mouth and dragged me into the bushes behind here at the school. And when they dragged me back there, I thought they were just joking, or I said, tell those girls to keep my clothes. I don't want them anyway. But I didn't realize what was going to happen to me. But when they dragged me back there, they knocked me down, and they kicked me, and they hit me everywhere they could hit me. And I was only 14 years old. But I didn't realize the extent of what was coming until they ripped my clothes off of me. And when they did that, I just call it that thing for so many years. But today I can just say that they brutally raped me over and over, one by one. I can't say how many boys did this, but there were so many. And they did that to me until I passed out. I don't know why they did that to me. I don't know why it was me they did that to. But it was horrible. I don't know how long I laid there on that ground back there. For so long I laid there until when I woke up, I was all bloody. My legs were all bloody. Even my head was bleeding. I lost my mind. I didn't know if it was day or night. I couldn't even find where I was at.
My name is George Aganash. Well, I was going to talk about my schooling in Red Lake Mission School and Pipestone in Red Lake. Before I went to school, that's all I talked was Indian. Did everything in Indian. But when I got to the Red Lake, I didn't know a bit of English. All I talked was Indian. To this day, I don't know. I can still talk some. I can understand it, but I just never got around to fully get back to where I was, because in Red Lake Mission School, St. Mary's Mission School in Red Lake, when you talk Indian there, they make you wash your mouth out with soap. I don't know how many times I went through that, but I still try to talk, but they do the same thing. We got to teach you the white man way. Now there's a mission school. In my religion, they wanted to, when I didn't go to church, no place. To this day, I still don't go to church for what they did to me. And all that, I don't know. I don't know why they did it. We're human, just like everybody else was. And my brothers, my sisters on my side, we all went to the same schools. And I don't know why they sent us over there, but then from there I went to Pipestone Indian School in Pipestone down the southern part of the state. Same thing happened. We tried to talk our language, they'd give us lickings. Beat you. Put your hands out. They use a strap or a board. I've seen some kids there with broken hands just for trying to talk their language. Then they try to make me into a Catholic. I wouldn't do that. I got a licking for that. And there's a lot of things I did. I tried to run away from Pipestone 3 times. I got caught. When I got back, I got some more thrashing. A little severe than the other ones. So they finally went home again. I didn't finish school. I mean, I finished Pipestone, but I went to Flandreau, South Dakota then, Indian school there. That was a nice school, I thought, because, you could do what you wanted to do over there. I didn't finish there, though, but I just got tired of being pushed around, thrashed up. I come home, I joined the Army. From there, I'm still trying to learn some of my language. Someday I'm going to be talking Indian to you. I talk some of it now yet, but not like my brother was, Joe. And after I got out of the Army, come back home, I had to work at home. only way things got done at home, I had to work. I couldn't go no place. When I was young, I couldn't go no place. I had a rough life. But I got 9 kids. Something happened, one of them passed away. And someday maybe they always say I'm crabby, but maybe that's the way life made me, I guess. But thank you anyway for this.
There was a lot of pain from my childhood since my dad died when I was 10 years old. My mom came home one day and said he was gone. She went about the business of burying him, but never did we ever get a chance to talk about our dad or how we felt about losing our dad. And that pain of losing my dad and not even being able to talk about it or share. All of those years, and I guess even to this day, we really haven't, as a family, sat down and talked about how we felt. And I was 10 years old, so that meant all of my younger brothers and sisters were even younger, and most of them don't even remember. And my baby sister was born 7 months after he passed. So it was about the business of living life daily that we.
But you know, I'm glad that somebody made that first step. Made that first step to recovery. Because I know that there are people in here that I have talked to today that are still bleeding, that are still mad, still very angry. At the way we had to be. But the one good thing that I know, and the one good thing that comforts me, and the one thing that I tell my children is Indian people, first Americans, are known for their perseverance. They are known for their stamina. They are known to be knocked down flat on their face, but they'll get up and they'll charge right back there again and keep on keeping on. And today I'm praising God for my brothers and my sisters that never allowed them to strip away everything. I'm glad for the ones that were stubborn, that held on to their language and held on to the songs and held on to the culture no matter what they did. I bless you for that today.
Throughout the journey, we repeatedly heard, "I have a hard time hugging my children. I don't like it when someone hugs me." Many said, "I never heard my parents say I love you. Because I never heard it, I didn't say I love you to my children." The boarding school took away our ability to love.
It wasn't until she was 50 years of age when she put her arms around us and said she loved us. But it took that long for us to break down that barrier between mother and daughter, mother and son. I used to say, "Mom, put your arms around me and tell me you love me." And I don't know how old I was at that time, probably about 28. But I went.
What I remember about my childhood with the relationship that I had with my mother is probably when I was about 6 years old. My sister and I were standing at her bedroom door and we were daring each other. "Go in and tell her that you love her. Now you go in and tell her. Now I dare you to go in and tell her." So they said, well, Brenda, you know, she loves you the most because you're her real daughter, so why don't you go in and tell her that you love her? Now, we had never been hugged. We'd never been told that we were loved. We didn't have any kind of affection in our family when I was growing up. And so it was a big deal. I was scared to go tell my mother that I loved her. I was physically scared to tell her. I was shaking. And I went in, I tiptoed in, and I went up to her, and I said, I love you! Took off, running out the door, because I was afraid what she was going to do to me. Can you imagine being afraid of what your mother is going to do to you because you went and told her that you loved her? But that's how I was raised. And I never told my mother I loved her the whole time I was growing up. She never told me. I never told my grandmother that I loved her until I was an adult.
But one of the things that I know in our later life as we learn how to hug each other and to say that we love one another, it was hard for her to accept us to hug her. She would just get really stiff and sit there and accept that hug. But you could tell it was a very hard for her to accept her own children hugging her. But we've had to learn how to hug our own children and tell our children that we love them. And I suppose that my children didn't hear me say that until way after that they were pretty much grown, except my youngest one.
As we went 4th, 5th grade, my teacher always said, you're filthy, you smell. And so it brought shame to my life. That's what he wanted. We became ashamed of who we are, where we came from. And that brought a lot of obstacles in my life. Now I teach my children, my grandkids, to be truthful. So Joey, forgive me if I was a mother that I thought I should be, you wanted me to be. I was just learning. I learned the wrong way. I asked my daughter, Crystal, my son, Brian. My teachers were my mothers, my grandparents, the women. That's how I should have taught my children. That's why I say I wish I didn't go to school. I am going to be the one to break that cycle. I truly believe that because I made that commitment to myself, to my children, and to my students. What I went through in the boarding school, what it did to me brought shame to me. I felt so ashamed of my language that took a healing tube to turn it around, to appreciate it. It wasn't like that. I was wrong, Creator. Forgive me, spirits. Not too long ago, I just finally started to tell my children that I love them. I didn't know how to say I love you. I didn't know how to hug them. I actually had to force myself to tell my children that I love them. Because I felt numb for so many years. I felt anger for so many years. I was lost for so many years.
Because today I'm able to accept myself for who I am and not what I am. I don't care if people see me as a half-breed Indian or a half-breed white. It doesn't matter to me anymore. because now I am comfortable with me. And a lot of that came from forgiveness. On this journey of forgiveness is something that we all need, because I know we all have some secrets inside that's really hard for us to forgive. One of the things that was really hard for me to, when I started trying to work on forgiveness, was to get my kids to forgive me for what I did to them when I was drinking. My oldest son hated my guts because I walked out and I left him. And I never went back. And when I walked out and I left him, I thought to myself, after I kind of come to, after about a week's drunk, and I thought, what man would walk out and leave their kids like that? And that really bothered me, because I realized that I wasn't a man. I just up and left them kids. When I walked out and left them, I didn't want to be seen, I didn't want to be heard from or anything. I didn't want nobody to know anything about me or what was happening. I wanted them to think I was dead. And some of them did think that way.
I came out of there totally ashamed of who I am, what I am. In the late 60s, I went back to the culture on my own. I let my hair grow. I started speaking my language. And in one of those times, I fasted. I did the vision quest for 5 years. In one of those years, it was a beautiful night. Stars were out, and it was calm. It's just beautiful. And it was around midnight, and I got up and I prayed. And I sat down and sat there for a while, and then all of a sudden I had these like a flashbacks of Sand Creek, Wounded Knee. And every policy, every law that was imposed on us by the government and the churches hit me one at a time. One at a time. And how it affected my life. And as I sat there, I got angrier and angrier until it turned to hatred. And I looked at the whole situation, the whole picture, and there was nothing I could do. It's too much. The only thing I could do, to me, was when I come off that hill, I'm going to grab a gun and I'm going to start shooting. And go that way. Maybe then my grandfathers will honor me if I go that route. I got up and I came around and I faced the east direction. And it was beautiful. I mean, it was dawn, light, enough light to see the rolling hills out there. And right above that blue light, in that darkness, was the sliver of the moon and the morning star. And I wanted to live. I want to live. I want to be happy. I feel I deserve that. But the only way that I was going to do that was if I forgive. And I cried that morning because I had to forgive. Since then, every day I work on that commitment. Now, I don't know how many people felt it, but every one of us, if you're a Lakota, you have to deal with that at some point in your life. then you have to address it. You have to make a decision. If you don't, you're gonna die on the road someplace. Either from being too drunk, or you might take a gun to your head if you don't handle those situations. So this isn't history. I mean, it's still with us. What has happened in the past will never leave us. Next 100, 200 years, it'll be with us. And we have to deal with that every day.
A long time ago, before the coming of the Lightskins, we Native people, we lived on this earth that the Creator made for us. And He had this earth run according to a set of principle, laws, and values. So we learned from the elders that there was a world we could see and there was a world we could not see. In each tribe, wherever they lived on the earth, these were the things that they were taught. This was the source of our native culture originally. And so this is the way our villages looked like. We had a language, we had values, we had cultures, ceremonies, spirituality. And we taught the young boys how to become men. And the young girls, we taught them how to become women. And then, of course, the women, we taught them how to become elders. And of course, the males, we taught them how to become elders. And then the elders, they had a job. And that was who we went to because they were the most knowledgeable about the teachings, about the spirituality, about the ceremonies. And so their job was to be available to us to make sure that we did things in the right way and in a natural order. During these days, we didn't have problems like we have today. We didn't have domestic violence. We didn't have teen suicides. We didn't have the rapes. We didn't have the abuses. Because we were taught how to live in harmony. But then when the boarding school came along, and what that boarding school was designed to do was to take the children away from our communities. And it removed the children from the spirituality, the ceremonies, and language. It removed us from teaching the children. And so what happened then is the knowledge started to disappear. The children were no longer learning the knowledge of what we taught them. And so what happened to us then is, this thing that happened to us is something that we now are able to call historical trauma. What is historical trauma? Is a combination of immense losses and traumatic events that are perpetrated upon an entire culture. For us, the design of the boarding school system was to remove culture, remove the language, the land, the people, the way of life, the religion, and to destroy the family structure. And so these little children that went to the boarding school, they no longer learned the spirituality, the ceremonies, and the culture, and the values. But what they did learn when they were at these boarding schools is they were beat, and so they learned to be violent to each other. They learned to hurt each other. They took away the language, there were no teachings, and so the sexual abuse that went on in these schools, soap in the mouth when they spoke the language, no ceremonies. So when these young children grew up and they came back home, then what did they bring with them? This is where we saw the first appearance of alcoholism, the first appearance of the violence. And so we started hurting each other, and the sexual abuse started to appear in our communities. As a result, the boarding schools, the mission schools, and the residential schools. Then what did they do when they came home? Is that when they got married and they started to parent, they had a tendency to parent the same way that they were parented in the boarding schools. This is being passed down generation to generation. And that's what this whole thing is about, is how do we break this cycle? How do we stop this cycle of the intergenerational trauma that we are handing down from generation to generation?
I started working in the community and realized there's a lot of Indian kids Because my analysis is there are a lot of Indian kids in the social welfare system in foster care because of broken families, because of the legacy, the historical legacy of boarding schools, because you had, in some instances, 4 or 5 generations of Indian people who were institutionalized and as a result didn't know how to parent. And so you had this intergenerational trauma, this transmission of woundedness and oppression, this vestige of cultural genocide that occurred in this country, and it was passed on from generation to generation.
What the elders tell us about this is that when the boarding school era come, at one time we were in harmony with the earth, but when they took the spirituality away, then it took us as a people, it took us off track, and then it got us very, very mixed up. So what the elders were very, very clear about is, in order for us to heal from this intergenerational trauma, we are going to need to bring back the spirituality. And when you bring back that spirituality, because the ways that we knew of it, it was in harmony with the principal laws and values of the earth. And what you will find is as we heal, we'll turn back to go to be in harmony, just like it was a long time ago. How do we do this? We asked the elders, how do we do this? And this is what they told us, as they said, by returning to the culture, returning to the teachings, returning to the principles, laws, and the values of our ancestors. And so we know in order for us to heal, if we listen to our elders, then this is what we need to do. Because this intergenerational trauma that was given to us by the boarding schools, the historical trauma, after being passed down generation to generation, is very deep in our psyche. And it lay dormant very, very deep as we handed on generation to generation. Then we entered into a healing time. And during this healing time, what we found is all of a sudden, these hurts from the past, they're starting to surface. And they start to show up. And we're wondering what is going on, because now what we are seeing in our communities is our young people are committing suicide. And we're seeing the alcoholism and the internal oppression. We're against one another sometimes. And what we start to see is the domestic violence. And we start to see fatherless homes. And we start to see the drugs and the effects of the alcohol and the sexual abuse. So this is what the elders told us. They said, in order for us to be free of this historical trauma, in order for us to make it go away, and for us to allow the healing process, that we are going to need to forgive. And we'll even need to forgive the unforgivable. And when we do this, the elders said, a great healing will occur across our lands. The real question is, would we be willing to go through the hurt and through the grief in the process? Will we cry now so that our children don't have to, that our babies won't have to cry? Most of us as Native people, we would take the pain so that our children wouldn't. And the elders are very, very clear for us is that we need to have the culture. We have to return to the culture. Because when we had the culture before, we didn't have all of these hurts. And so we know each of our nations, we have to return to the culture. Then they gave us some teachings on how to do this. How is it we heal? They said, recognize, acknowledge, forgive, and change. And that was the teaching we was to follow. That we were to recognize what this trauma is. Then once we were able to recognize this trauma, we had to acknowledge this did happen to us. What we are talking about here, what we saw in this video, this is real. It really did happen. And we need to have that acknowledged because many people don't know that it did. Then what our next task is to do is to forgive. Are we able to forgive the unforgivable? And then for us to make us a change, to come back to the culture. Then they give us these 4 directions of forgiveness. In the East is the basic forgiveness. In the South is forgiving the unforgivable. In the West was the forgiveness of self. In the North was the forgiveness of others. The basic forgiveness, what that is, just our normal forgiveness when we make mistakes during the day. Forgiving the unforgivable, Those would be things like the sexual abuse and some of those other things that we need to learn on how to forgive. And are we willing to do that? And sometimes even the harder one is the forgiveness of self for those things that we have done. Are we able to forgive ourselves? And the other is the forgiveness of others. And in this case, when we talk about the intergenerational trauma in the boarding schools, is are we willing to forgive the very people who did this to us? Not only do we have to forgive ourselves and to get free of this anger and the things that we are carrying around, but also those who did it, they have to forgive themselves also for what was done to us. But our healing is not depending upon whether they forgive or not. It's about whether we forgive. And we're the ones who have to make it free. Then the elders, they also told us that during this healing time is that every human being, no exception, every man, every woman, and every child, we are born with a greater purpose. That each of us was put here for a reason. And that greater purpose is to serve the Creator and help others. Many of you are chosen with a purpose to help with this healing. You can feel it. It's in your heart. It's like a song that must be sung. Some of you, that song is for children. Some is to help the women. Some is to help the communities. So are we able to go from the way our communities to look at like this? With the elders' guidance and the laws and the principles and the teachings that they're giving to us, these 4 laws of change, changes from within. In order for development to occur, it must be preceded by a vision. A great learning must occur, and you must create a healing forest. So what they told us, it works like this, is that when we went out of harmony, and then for many, many years, for us to get back, we each must create the vision, this vision of coming back to the culture. And as we create this vision of the spirituality, and we revision it like it was in the old days, then what we'll start to see is with the knowledge of the teachings, the principal laws, and the values, it will come to us and we will know what to do. So we have the ability to create the healing forest and for us to bring back in these times the community and how it was in the old days.
I know that the children in the boarding schools did not have that opportunity. It was a form of violence. It was a form of oppression that is so severe that I can equate it to Dachau and Auschwitz. And incidentally, I lived 4 years in Germany, and I visited those places. And I stood in those places. And the thing that got me was the similarities on another level. And unlike that period of history that Schindler's List was able to articulate, that Anne Frank was able to do in terms of educating the public about this moment of history, there is nothing equivalent for the American Indian people of this continent that does that. Where is our Schindler's List? Where is our Anne Frank? To be able to leverage that knowingness and insight, to have everybody to be held responsible for knowing this part of history, not for blame, victimization, or guilt, but simply to know. Because the truth is a precondition to justice. And as Lois Frank has and will talk about, the idea of justice as a precondition for healing and reconciliation. But truth in that process of truth and reconciliation is essential. And truth is a precondition for justice. And then once we talk about justice, it can be transformative and lead to true reconciliation and healing. So the past does not influence the here and now.
After we finished the 7,000-mile journey across the United States, we started to get a lot of calls from communities that the intergenerational trauma started to surface. One of the first lessons we learned on the journey, that one of the biggest issues in our community was unresolved grief. So in order to help the communities into the grieving process, we put together a training called Grief Recovery Coaches. Our goal is to have 2 grief recovery coaches in every community so that when the trauma and the forgiveness and these issues pop up, that we have a place to go and to process the grief. In addition to the grief recovery circles, the other thing is this documentary itself. It is available to get copies of but not just that, that if you get a copy that you can give it to anybody who wants it. You don't have to have our permission to do so. One of the major things we are going after now is an apology from President Obama to make an apology to our Native people for the government's role in a boarding school. On the White Bison website, www.whitebison.org, are the instructions on how to write to Congress, a petition that you can sign, and then also how do you get letters going to the White House. Also, we are putting together an Elders Mentoring Elders gatherings, and this is to help us during this healing time to strengthen our elder system. Then we are also appointing people to the Truth and Forgiveness Commission, that we have the opportunity to go back to the communities and for us to tell the story of what happened to us as Native people. And out of that, a report will be generated called the Commission's Report. Then we will also know there's a need to continue the intergenerational healing gatherings inside of the community themselves. What we realized is we entered into a healing time in the early 90s, and we entered into a time of prophecy fulfillment. And out of that, the Wellbriety Movement was born. In the tipping point, it's a concept that says in order to get the Wellbriety Movement to move, there needs to be a critical mass. And so people started to join together into the healing efforts, but the few that first started it, nothing happened. But as the persistence continued across the community and more people joined the movement, we started to see that the teeter-totter started to move just a little bit. But as we continued over the years to expand the movement and more people joined in the movement, then what we started to see is the movement started to spread across the United States. It's spreading into Canada, into Alaska. And so we started to see an alignment of critical mass. And so as the people continued to be involved in the movement and involved in the healing, then what we started to see is a widespread movement taking place among our Native people. So today, what we believe is that we are at a critical mass, that we are at the tipping point. What we believe is that among our people, as to years ago there was just a few people sober, now we have thousands of us are sober. There are thousands of us in recovery. We are having sobriety powwows and sobriety dances and types of roundups and various recovery movements spreading throughout the community. And so what it took such a few years to do in the past, the next 5 years, the next 10 years, we're going to see tremendous movement take place in the healing effort. So it's now time for us to all work together like we've never worked together before. We know what's broke and we know how to fix it, and we are finally going to tell a story and to let our voice be the one to tell the world the whole story of what happened in the boarding school.
Because this happened over 100 years ago, 130 years ago, and that historical trauma passes on from generation to generation. And we see many angry young people and others who don't even know why they're angry.
Denial can't remove the consequences of the choices in life that brought you here.
So they pulled our pants down, and that was our first whipping. The first day I got there, the first night.
Whip me all over my damn body.
You need to go back and honor those people and say sorry, because they really did suffer and starve.
before she went to bed, she would always hear screams from the boys' side of the boarding school.
And yes, there was sexual abuse in our time. Yes, there was. But we weren't allowed to talk about it.
Thinking about all of the children, thousands and thousands of children. Maybe over 100 years that were taken from people they knew and loved, torn away and taken to a place they didn't know or understand.
But today I can just say that they brutally raped me over and over, one by one.
This isn't history. I mean, it's still with us. What has happened in the past will never leave us.
Where is our Schindler's List? Where is our Anne Frank? To be able to leverage that knowingness and insight, to have everybody to be held responsible for knowing this part of history, not for blame, victimization, or guilt, but simply to know.
Why did we make this documentary? One is we want the world to know the story of the genocide of Native Americans. We also want the world to know the truth of what happened in the boarding schools. In order for us to heal from the intergenerational trauma, we choose to forgive. We know there are more boarding school stories out there that need to be shared. We know that the sharing of these stories with our relatives and with our friends has a lot to do that allows the healing to take place. If you have stories that you would like to share, please contact the White Bison website at www.whitebison.org.
When I was a young boy and afraid in the night, I knew that he would always be there to make things right. He told me, son, be happy and dream all that you can. And he said he'd always love me, my father in the man. I tried so hard to be just like the other kids in school, but I never was the same as them and followed my own rules. They said theirs was the real world, but from their world I ran. And then I lost myself, the son of an Indian man. troubled years trying to find my way. A better low, a better high, a better night and day. But what I found was trouble had only just began. But he always had faith in me, my father, Indian man. But then I turned to a woman and the happiness of love, but none could love me like my mom as she watched from up above. Mama was the only love who could really understand the son she'd made with my father, Indian man. Now I'm older and my father has become my closest friend, and I know his pride and love for me will be there to the end. And just like God has loved us since his whole thing first began, I love my God and my father, Indian man. I love my God and my father, Indian man. I love my God and my father, Indian